Chapter 1: The Threshold of Time. Greetings, weary traveler. Tonight, we are departing from the sanitized comforts of the 21st century. We are peeling back the velvet curtain of history to reveal the jagged, unpolished reality beneath. This is a journey through the obsidian corridors of human existence, a chronicle of pestilence, penance, and the humble pottage. We are peering behind the veil of the Middle Ages, not the cinematic version of chivalry and gleaming towers, but the visceral, breathing truth. Before we descend, consider this a sanctuary. Lower your lights. Perhaps activate a fan for a gentle, rhythmic white noise. If you find value in these deep dives into the shadows of the past, please consider supporting the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments where in the world you are currently drifting off from, in the exact hour on your clock. It is a profound privilege to share these nights with a global audience. Now, let the modern world fade. Let the glow of your screen become the flickering amber of a tallow candle. We are going back. Chapter 2: The Dawn of 1325. Salutations. You have successfully survived the night and materialized in the year of our Lord, 1325. The positive news? You are breathing. The unfortunate reality? So is every parasite within a 5-mile radius. Your resting place is a decaying straw pallet, teeming with vermin and dried stalks that carry the distinct, pungent aroma of a livestock stable, largely because it served that exact purpose 3 months prior. You can forget about ergonomic foam, down pillows, or high thread count linens. You are wrapped in a coarse wool shroud that hasn't seen soap since the previous harvest. It now possesses the approximate mass of a yearling calf due to the accumulated filth of several seasons. You stir as the local cathedral bell bellows across the landscape. This is the medieval equivalent of a smartphone alarm, though significantly more cacophonous and entirely devoid of a snooze function. Your domicile is a crude timber hovel consisting of a single chamber devoid of glass, featuring a communal layout where your kin, your goats, and an army of domestic insects coexist. The scent is a veritable sensory assault, a pungent bouquet of fermented ale, human perspiration, wet livestock, and a pervasive musk you desperately hope isn't black mold. But deep down, you know it is. Scents and perfumes are luxuries reserved for the divine or the dead. You attempt a morning stretch only to immediately regret the decision. The air is biting, and your joints protest with a chorus of pops. You are a mere 22 years of age, yet in this century you are essentially an elder. Your skeleton groans like a rusted gate, and your knees clatter like stones in a peasant's sack. Standing up is a literal gamble. Welcome to daybreak in medieval Europe, a place where privacy is an alien concept, and you are never truly solitary. Chapter 3: The Communal Ordeal. Having navigated the haystack of horrors that is your bed, you now face a biological imperative. Nature isn't just knocking, it's battering down the door. This is the moment you would trade your soul for a porcelain throne. In the 1300s, answering the call is a social venture, a public spectacle, and a constant hygienic hazard. For the common laborer, the bathroom is a singular wooden bucket tucked behind the dwelling, likely already brimming. The stench is nothing short of apocalyptic. You hold your breath, perform your duty, and then comes the grand finale, the disposal. You are expected to hurl the contents directly into the thoroughfare. While custom suggests shouting "Gardez-le," a corruption of the French "Gare de l'eau," meaning watch out for the water, the warning is rarely sufficient. The streets are essentially open arteries of human refuse and animal offal. Toilet paper? A myth. You make do with straw, dried leaves, or perhaps some damp moss if you're feeling aristocratic. Truly, a backdoor maneuver in every sense of the word. Chapter 4. The Banquet of Despair. You've survived the morning's indignities. Surely a hearty meal awaits. Think again. This is the 1300s. Comfort is a sin the world cannot afford. Breakfast is a somber, gray event. There are no poached eggs, no artisanal roasts. You huddle near the embers with a wooden bowl filled with a substance that looks suspiciously like something scraped from a wagon wheel. Welcome to your daily serving of pottage, a gelatinous, slow-simmered gruel of oats, legumes, and whatever wild roots haven't yet turned to mush. This cauldron has likely been bubbling for weeks, with new scraps tossed in to replace what was eaten. It isn't a recipe, it's a culinary fossil record. Beside this, you have a slab of bread so desiccated it could serve as a blunt force weapon. To wash it down? Forget fresh water. That's a cocktail of cholera and parasites. Instead, you consume small beer. From sunrise to sunset, everyone, from infants to the elderly, is perpetually mildly intoxicated on weak ale. It's the only way to stay hydrated without a guaranteed death sentence by dysentery. Chapter 5. The Spectral Terror. As you prepare for the day's labor, you linger at the threshold of your hut. In 1325, the tangible world is merely the surface. Beneath it lies a landscape of terrors you cannot perceive, but absolutely believe in. That scratching on the roof last night? Your neighbor insists it was a night hag, a demonic entity that perches on your sternum to siphon your vitality. Every shadow in the forest conceals a changeling or a malicious sprite waiting to substitute your newborn with a bundle of enchanted twigs. You don't just fear the cough. You fear the evil eye of the disgruntled woman at the village edge. You keep a shard of iron in your tunic because it's common knowledge that the hidden folk abhor the touch of cold metal. You avoid the crossroads after twilight, for that is where the unquiet dead gather to mutter. In your reality, the supernatural isn't folklore, it's a structural hazard. You cross yourself when you sneeze because that brief moment of bodily release is when your soul is most susceptible to being snatched by a passing wraith. It is an exhausting existence, knowing that every catastrophe, from a soured batch of milk to a lame ox, is a calculated strike from the unseen world. Continuing through the textile industry, the arrival of Sophie in Russia, and the early years of the Catherine the Great saga. Chapter 6. Textiles and Ticks. Now, let us discuss your attire, or rather, your singular attire. Your wardrobe consists of one outfit, worn until it literally surrenders to the elements. It's a scratchy wool tunic, or a linen smock that you've occupied for months, perhaps years. Fashion doesn't exist. There is only durability. Undergarments are a luxury you likely lack, meaning you are navigating the world commando beneath layers of abrasive, salt-crusted wool. Without laundry facilities or caustic soaps, your clothing becomes a living ecosystem. It is stained, rigid with grime, and scented like a wet dog that spent the afternoon in a tanning pit. Washing clothes is a Herculean effort involving hauling gallons of water and scrubbing with wood ash, a process done maybe twice a year. Consequently, your skin is a perpetual battlefield. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs are your constant companions, inhabiting the seams of your garments and the pores of your skin. Whether you are a monk, a merchant, or a child, You are a walking insect colony. You'll find yourself casually scratching a bite while conversing with the village priest, and neither of you will find it noteworthy.
7. The marital cage and the toy soldiers. Catherine's union with Peter was a catastrophic mismatch. While Catherine was devouring the works of Enlightenment philosophers, Peter was playing with tin soldiers and hanging rats in his bedchamber for treason. He was immature, erratic, and harbored a visceral hatred for the very nation he was meant to lead. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia, the very man the Russian army was currently fighting. For nearly 20 years, Catherine existed in a gilded cage. She was monitored, isolated, and neglected. Yet, in the shadows of the Winter Palace, she was building a network. She charmed the military. She befriended the intelligentsia. And she positioned herself as the true Russian, alternative to her volatile husband. She understood that power in Russia didn't flow through bloodlines alone. It flowed through the bayonets of the Imperial Guard. When Peter finally ascended the throne and immediately began dismantling Russian traditions, Catherine knew the hour had struck. It was no longer a matter of ambition. It was a matter of survival. The Iron Empress, the Crimson Queen, and the Painter of Pain. 8. The coup d'etat, the usurpation of 1762. By July 1762, the atmosphere in St. Petersburg was thick with the scent of ozone and treason. Peter III had occupied the throne for a mere 6 months, yet he had managed to alienate every pillar of Russian stability. He had insulted the Orthodox clergy by attempting to secularize church lands, and had humiliated the Imperial Guard by forcing them into tight, Prussian-style uniforms. Catherine recognized that the momentum was nearing its zenith. While Peter was sequestered at his summer retreat in Oranienbaum, indulging in military drills with his Holstein guards, Catherine was spirited away to the capital in the dead of night, escorted by the Orloff brothers, a trio of brawny, fiercely loyal officers. She appeared before the Izmailovsky regiment, clad in a borrowed guard's uniform, her hair windswept and her eyes burning with resolve. She was proclaimed the sole autocrat of all the Russias. The transition was remarkably bloodless, a testament to Peter's total lack of support. When the news reached the Tsar, he collapsed into a state of indecisive panic. Within days, he signed a formal abdication, surrendering his crown to the wife he had once threatened to imprison. Shortly thereafter, Peter met his end in a secluded estate under circumstances that remained officially murky. A fatal bout of hemorrhoidal colic, though the bruised neck suggested a more manual intervention. Catherine was no longer a consort. She was the North Star. 9. The philosopher on the throne. Enlightenment and ambition. Catherine did not intend to rule as a mere placeholder. She envisioned herself as the philosopher queen, a monarch who governed by the light of reason rather than the darkness of dogma. She entered into a prolific, decades-long correspondence with the titans of the French Enlightenment, Voltaire, Diderot, and D'Alembert. She flattered them, financed them, and used them to curate her image as the most sophisticated ruler in Christendom. Her most ambitious domestic project was the Nakaz, or the Instruction. This was a monumental legal treatise, heavily influenced by Montesquieu, advocating for the abolition of torture and the equality of all citizens before the law. In 1767, she convened the Legislative Commission, a diverse gathering of nobles, merchants, and even free peasants, to rewrite the Russian legal code. It was a radical experiment in representative government within an autocracy. However, the harsh realities of the Russian frontier and the resistance of the landed nobility eventually forced these grand ideals into the shadows. Catherine learned a bitter lesson. One could speak of liberty in the salons of Paris, but one ruled Russia with a firm, uncompromising hand. 10. The Pugachev Storm, a mirror to the abyss. In 1773, the fragile peace of the interior was shattered by a man named Yemelyan Pugachev, a charismatic Cossack with a scarred face. Pugachev claimed to be the resurrected Peter III, returning to liberate the serfs from the German usurper. His rebellion was a wildfire. Thousands of peasants, miners, and Cossacks rallied to his banner, slaughtering landowners and capturing fortresses along the Volga. For Catherine, this was a moment of profound existential dread. The rebellion exposed the gaping wound of Russian society, the brutal, dehumanizing system of serfdom. For over a year, Pugachev reigned over a shadow empire. When the revolt was finally crushed by Catherine's seasoned generals, the retaliation was swift and merciless. Pugachev was transported to Moscow in an iron cage and publicly dismembered. The event permanently hardened Catherine. The idealistic reformer died, and in her place remained an empress who prioritized stability and the loyalty of the nobility over the liberation of the masses. 11. The Enigma in Scarlet, the discovery of Temple 13th. We leave the frozen tundras of Russia and descend into the emerald humidity of the Chiapas jungle. In 1994, within the ancient Mayan city of Palenque, a team of archaeologists made a discovery that would rewrite our understanding of female power in Mesoamerica. Adjacent to the legendary Temple of the Inscriptions lay Temple 13th, a modest pyramid that had long been overshadowed by its neighbor, deep within its limestone bowels. Behind a meticulously sealed portal, they discovered a subterranean chamber. Inside sat a monolithic stone sarcophagus. When the heavy lid was winched open, the researchers were met with a sight of jarring, visceral beauty. The interior was saturated in a brilliant, toxic red dust, cinnabar. This crushed mercury sulfide was a sacred substance, symbolizing the lifeblood of the cosmos. Lying within this crimson shroud was the skeletal remains of a woman, her form adorned with hundreds of pieces of luminous green jade. 12. The Red Queen. Ritual, rebirth, and cinnabar. Who was this Red Queen? She was buried with a level of reverence typically reserved for the highest kings. Her face was concealed beneath a complex mosaic mask of jade tiles, a spiritual shield meant to preserve her identity. During her harrowing journey, through the Mayan underworld Xibalba. Forensic analysis revealed she was a woman of roughly 60 years, her bones showing the signs of a lifetime of privilege, and the toxic effects of the very cinnabar that surrounded her. The prevailing theory suggests she was Lady Zakbu Ejel, the wife of the great King Pakal. Her burial was a mirror image of his own. In the Mayan worldview, the universe was held in a delicate balance of masculine and feminine energies. By burying the Red Queen in a sea of scarlet next to her husband, the Maya were ensuring that the cosmic order remained intact, even in the silence of the grave. 13. Frida Kahlo, the icon of the Blue House. Centuries later, in the same Mexican soil, another woman of extraordinary grit would redefine the boundaries of identity and endurance. Born in 1907, in the Casa Azul of Coyoacan, Frida Kahlo was a creature of fierce contradictions. Her father was a precise German-Hungarian photographer. Her mother, a devoutly religious woman of Spanish and indigenous descent. Frida's early years were shaped by the spectre of polio, which left her with a withered leg and a profound sense of isolation. But it was the afternoon of September 17, 1925, that would irrevocably shatter her world. A wooden bus collided with a streetcar, and a metal handrail pierced Frida's body like a spear. Her spine was broken in 3 places. Her pelvis was crushed and her foot was pulverized. In the aftermath of the crash, her body was found dusted in gold powder, a bizarre, shimmering contrast to the carnage. 14. The Broken Column, painting the reality of pain. Confined to a bed of plaster and steel for months on end, Frida began to paint. She used a mirror positioned above her canopy to capture the only subject she truly knew, herself. She famously remarked, "I am not a surrealist. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." Her work was a visceral autopsy of her own soul. In The Broken Column, she depicts herself split open, an ionic pillar crumbling within her chest, her skin held together by nails and a surgical brace. Her marriage to the muralist Diego Rivera was a second accident, a tempestuous, obsessive union of 2 giants who could neither live together nor apart. Frida didn't just paint. She existed as a political and cultural manifesto. She wore traditional Tijuana dresses as an act of anti-imperialist defiance and painted the blood, the miscarriages, and the betrayals that the world preferred to keep hidden. 15. Conclusion. The stubborn light of history. As we conclude this journey, we find a common thread connecting the mud-spattered peasants of 1325, the iron-willed Catherine, the scarlet-shrouded Red Queen, and the defiant Frida. History is not merely a collection of dates. It is a testament to the staggering resilience of the human spirit. These individuals navigated worlds of absolute darkness, plagues, coups, toxic rituals, and shattering accidents. Yet they refused to be extinguished. Tonight, as you rest in the sanctuary of the modern world, perhaps take a moment to acknowledge the sheer improbable luck of your existence. You are the heir to those who survived the fleas, the cinnabar, and the metal handrails. Part 3. The Pulse of the Past. 16. The Barber Surgeon and the Balance of Blood. In 1325, if you fell ill, you didn't seek a doctor. You sought a balance. Medicine was governed by the theory of the four humours, an ancient belief that your health was dictated by the levels of blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile in your system. If you had a fever, your blood was too hot and too plentiful. The solution was as brutal as the disease, bloodletting. You would visit the local barber, yes, the same man who trimmed your beard, who would use a rusted lancet or a jar of hungry leeches to drain your vitality until you turned pale. There was no anesthesia, only a swig of sour ale and a wooden peg to bite on. If you had a wound, it might be cauterized with a red-hot iron, or packed with dung and honey. Infection wasn't seen as a biological process. It was a spiritual judgment or an imbalance of the air. This was a world where the cure was often more lethal than the ailment. 17. The Potemkin myth and the Black Sea ambition. As Catherine the Great expanded her empire southward, she relied on the towering figure of Grigory Potemkin. He wasn't just her lover. He was the architect of the new Russia. When Catherine toured the newly conquered lands of the Crimea, legend says Potemkin built hollow, painted villages to trick her into seeing prosperity where there was only dust. While the Potemkin village is likely a myth born of jealous courtiers, the reality was even more impressive. Potemkin built entire naval bases like Sevastopol from nothing. He transformed the Black Sea from an Ottoman lake into a Russian playground. Catherine's navy, once a laughingstock, achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Chesme, where they burned the Ottoman fleet to the waterline. This wasn't just about land, it was about the Greek project. Catherine's dream of reclaiming Constantinople and restoring the Byzantine Empire with her grandson on the throne. 18. The architecture of eternity. Palenque's layout. To understand the Red Queen, you must understand the city she inhabited. Palenque was a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering and symbolic architecture. The Maya didn't just build pyramids. They built a map of the universe, the Temple of the Inscriptions, where King Pakal was buried, faced the setting sun, the direction of death. Temple 13th, housing the Red Queen, was tucked alongside it, symbolizing her role as the companion to the sun's descent. Her jade mask was a miracle of craftsmanship, composed of over 200 individual pieces of malachite and jadeite. Each stone was a plea for immortality. Jade, being green, linked the deceased to the maid's god, who dies and is reborn every season. By wearing the mask, the Red Queen wasn't just a dead woman. She was a germinating seed, waiting for the rains of the afterlife to bring her back to the world of the living. 19. Frida's internal anatomy. The two Fridas. Frida Kahlo's work is often misinterpreted as mere surrealism, but every brushstroke was a coded message. In her masterpiece, The Two Fridas, we see the profound duality of her soul following her divorce from Diego Rivera. On the left, she is the European Frida in a Victorian lace dress. her heart torn open and bleeding, a surgical hemostat barely stopping the flow. On the right, she is the Mexican Frida, holding a tiny portrait of Diego. A single vein connects the two hearts, looping around their arms like an umbilical cord. It is a portrait of a woman trying to hold herself together while her identity is being ripped in two. The stormy sky in the background reflects the internal turbulence of a body that was constantly in rebellion against its own bones. Frida used her art to perform the surgeries that the doctors couldn't. She operated on her own spirit. 20. The shadow of the church. The medieval soul. Finally, we must return to the absolute authority of the 14th century church. In your village in 1325, the priest is the most powerful man you know. He holds the keys to the only thing more important than your life, your eternity. Religion wasn't a choice. It was the atmosphere. You paid a tithe, 10% of your meager harvest, to the church. Even if your children were starving, you lived in constant terror of purgatory, a middle ground of fire where your soul would be purified for thousands of years unless your family paid for masses to be said in your name. Every eclipse, every lightning strike, and every deformed calf was a message from God, or a trick of the devil. This psychological pressure created a society that was perpetually on edge, oscillating between ecstatic devotion and paralyzing fear. Part 4. The Scourge and the Gavel. 21. The Invisible Assassin. The Arrival of the Plague. While your life in 1325 is already a struggle against grime and hunger, a shadow is beginning to stir in the East that will eventually dismantle European society entirely. We must discuss the Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague. Though it hasn't fully arrived in your village yet, the rumors are trickling in with the merchants. They speak of the great mortality. It is a death that starts with a bubo, a swelling in the groin, or armpit the size of an apple, turning a bruised necrotic purple. Within days, the lungs fill with fluid, and the victim coughs up a black, frothy blood. In your world, there is no understanding of fleas or rats. You blame the miasma, the bad air, or the alignment of Saturn and Jupiter. The terror is psychological as much as physical. Parents abandon children. Priests refuse last rites. The very fabric of community dissolves as the living become too few to bury the dead. We will spend time sitting in that silence, the sound of empty villages where the only noise is the wind through the thatch. 22. Medieval justice. Trial by ordeal. If you are accused of a crime in 1325, the concept of innocent until proven guilty is a fantasy. Justice is a divine performance. We must explore the trial by ordeal. If the evidence is unclear, the court leaves the verdict to God. You might be forced to undergo the ordeal of hot water, where you must plunge your arm into a boiling cauldron to retrieve a stone. Your arm is then wrapped in clean linen. 3 days later, a priest inspects the wound. If it is healing cleanly, God has signaled your innocence. If it is festering and scorched, you are guilty, and the executioner awaits. There is also the ordeal of the cross, where the accuser and the accused stand with arms outstretched like a crucifix. The first one to drop their arms loses the case. In this world, the law isn't about facts. It's about endurance and the perceived favor of the heavens. 23. Catherine's Secret Cabinet, The Art of Espionage. Returning to Russia, we must look at how Catherine maintained her grip on such a volatile empire. She was a master of the secret chancellery. Catherine understood that a throne won by a coup is a throne that can be lost by one. She managed a vast network of informants that permeated every level of society, from the scullery, maids in the Winter Palace, to the generals on the frontier. She read the intercepted mail of foreign ambassadors and her own ministers. She used the Black Cabinet, a specialized room where letters were opened, copied and resealed so perfectly that the sender never knew they were being watched. This wasn't just paranoia, it was statecraft. To rule Russia, Catherine had to know what was being whispered in the dark corners of the taverns and the silk-lined parlors of the aristocrats. 24. The Anatomy of a Mayan City. The Water Miracles. In Palenque, the Red Queen lived in a city that was a marvel of engineering. The Maya were obsessed with water, which they called the blood of the earth. Palenque was built over the Ottolum River, and the Maya didn't just live near it, they channeled it. They built vaulted underground aqueducts that ran beneath the plazas, creating a pressurized water system that could feed fountains and keep the city clean even during the dry season. This water magic was a sign of the king and queen's divine power. They controlled the life-giving force of the rain and the earth. When you walked through the city, you would hear the constant murmur of flowing water beneath the stone, a reminder that the Red Queen and her husband were the masters of the elements. 25. Frida's Botanical Rebellion. The Garden of the Casa Azul. Finally, we return to Frida's garden. For Frida, plants were not just decoration. They were symbols of fertility, resilience, and Mexican heritage. She filled the Casa Azul with cacti, agave, and tropical flowers. In her paintings, she often depicted herself intertwined with vines or roots, as if she were literally growing out of the Mexican soil. These weren't just pretty plants. They were often sharp, thorny, and stubborn. Just like her, she used the imagery of the maguey plant, which produces the fermented drink pulque, as a symbol of the raw, unrefined spirit of the Mexican people. Her garden was her laboratory, a place where she could cultivate the beauty that her body often denied her. Part 5. The Hunger, the Cannon, and the Sacred Blade. 26. The Great Famine. When the sky turned black. Before the plague of 1347, your ancestors in 1325 were already reeling from a cataclysm of a different kind. The Great Famine of 1315, 1317. You grew up in the shadow of this memory. It began with rain, not a cleansing spring shower, but a relentless cold deluge that lasted for months. The crops rotted in the sodden earth. The salt could not be recovered from the sea to preserve meat. The hay could not dry to feed the livestock. In your village, the old ones still whisper about the hunger that turned men into beasts. In 1315, the price of grain rose by 300%. Families ate the seed corn meant for the next year. They ate the workhorses. They ate the dogs. In the darkest corners of the archives, there are reports of parents consuming the flesh of the deceased. This wasn't a bad season. It was a total collapse of the biological contract. By 1325, the population is smaller. The people are physically stunted, and the collective psyche is scarred. You live with the hunger memory, a perpetual fear that the next rainstorm might be the one that ends the world again. 27. The Battle of Chesme. Catherine's fireships. While Catherine wrote letters to Voltaire, she was also overseeing the brutal mechanics of naval expansion. In 1770, she sent her Baltic fleet on an unprecedented journey around the entirety of Europe to confront the Ottoman navy in the Aegean Sea. This led to the Battle of Chesme, a masterclass in 18th century carnage. Catherine's lover, Alexei Orlov, commanded the fleet, but it was the tactical use of fireships that secured the win. These were old vessels packed with pitch, sulfur, and gunpowder, set ablaze and steered directly into the crowded Ottoman line. The resulting explosion was so immense, it was said to be seen from the Anatolian coast. The Ottoman fleet was decimated, trapped in the bay as their own wooden ships turned into floating pyres. Catherine used this victory to secure the Treaty of Küçükçaynak, which gave Russia its first permanent foothold on the Black Sea, and the right to protect all Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. This was the birth of the Eastern Question that would haunt European diplomacy for the next 150 years. 28. The sacred bloodletting, the Red Queen's duty. For the Red Queen of Palenque, power was not just about wearing jade. It was about the shedding of blood. The Maya believed that the gods had sacrificed their own blood to create the world, and in return, the royal family had to pay the debt through auto-sacrifice. As a high-ranking noblewoman, the Red Queen would have participated in agonizing rituals. Using obsidian blades or stingray spines, she would pierce her tongue or her ears. In some rituals, a cord with thorns was pulled through the wound, and the resulting blood was dripped onto bark paper, which was then burned. The smoke was the vision serpent, or a gateway through which the ancestors could speak. This wasn't seen as self-harm. It was a sacred duty. The Red Queen was a literal conduit for the divine. Her scars were her credentials. When she walked through the plazas, the people didn't just see a queen. They saw the woman whose blood kept the sun rising. 29. The architecture of the soul. The Casa Azul layout. Frida Kahlo's home, the Casa Azul, was designed as a fortress for her spirit. After her father died and her health plummeted, she transformed the house into a literal map of her internal world. The house is built around a central courtyard, a common Spanish colonial design, but Frida added her own revolutionary flair. She painted the walls a vibrant, saturated cobalt blue to ward off evil spirits and to celebrate the colors of indigenous Mexico. Her studio was positioned so she could look out at the garden while she worked. even when she was confined to her wheelchair. In her bedroom, the mirror on the underside of her bed's canopy remained until the day she died. The house was a living organism. Its heart was the kitchen with its traditional yellow tiles. Its lungs were the garden, and its memory was the collection of pre-Columbian idols she and Diego collected. To walk through the Casa Azul today is to walk through Frida's anatomy. 30. The sumptuary laws dressing your station. In 1325, if you suddenly found a pot of gold, you couldn't just buy a silk tunic. You would be arrested. This was the era of sumptuary laws. These were legal codes that dictated exactly what you could wear based on your social class. If you were a peasant, you were legally restricted to rough wool and linen in drab colors like brown, grey, or madder red. Fur was strictly for the nobility, and even then only certain types. A merchant might be allowed fox fur, but only a duke could wear ermine. These laws were designed to keep the social order visible at a glance. In a world where your worth was determined by birth, the clothing was the bark of the social tree. If a commoner wore a tippet, a long, hanging sleeve, that was too long. They could be fined or publicly shamed. Your clothes weren't just protection from the cold. They were your prison cell. Part 6. Stone, Stars, and the Sovereign's Will. 31. The Anatomy of Defense. The Medieval Fortress. In 1325, the castle was not a romantic residence. It was a brutal machine of war. If you were a peasant fleeing a localized conflict, the sight of those limestone walls was both a salvation and a reminder of your subservience. The design of the castle evolved as a response to the science of the siege. We must look at the concentric circle layout. You didn't just walk into a fortress, you navigated a lethal gauntlet. First, there was the moat, often a stagnant, disease-ridden trench, designed to prevent undermining, the practice of digging tunnels to collapse the walls. Then came the barbican, a reinforced gateway, where you were trapped between two sets of iron grills called portcullises. While you were stuck, defenders would rain down murder holes, slots in the ceiling through which they poured boiling water, hot sand or stones. Every spiral staircase in the castle turned clockwise. Why? Because most attackers were right-handed, and as they ascended, the central stone pillar blocked their sword arm, while the defender, looking down, had a clear, wide arc to strike. The castle was a physical manifestation of the physics of killing. 32. The Diplomatic Circus. Catherine's Crimean Journey. In 1787, Catherine the Great embarked on what was perhaps the most expensive road trip in human history, to show the world, and specifically the Ottoman Empire, that Russia now owned the south. She travelled from St. Petersburg to the Crimea. This wasn't just a carriage ride. It was a 6-month procession involving thousands of courtiers, musicians and soldiers. Catherine travelled in a massive, heated galley on the Dnieper River, accompanied by a fleet of 80 ships. Along the banks, her favourite, Potemkin, orchestrated elaborate fireworks displays and recruited local peasants to dress in their finest clothes to wave at the passing empress. This is where the term Potemkin village truly takes root. But the reality was more sophisticated than a mere facade. It was a display of soft power. Catherine invited the Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph II, to travel incognito with her. By the time they reached the Black Sea, she had convinced the most powerful man in Europe that Russia was an unstoppable force of nature. She wasn't just touring her lands, she was performing the role of a goddess of the north. 33. The mathematicians of the jungle. Maya timekeeping. While Europe was struggling to calculate the date of Easter, the Maya, including the Red Queen's contemporaries, were mastering the cosmos. They didn't just track the sun, they tracked the synodic period of Venus with an error margin of only a few minutes over centuries. The Maya used a base 20 mathematical system and, crucially, were one of the first civilizations to utilize the concept of zero. Their calendar was a complex interlocking of 3 different cycles. The Tzolk'in, a 260-day sacred count, the Harb, a 365-day solar year, and the long count, which tracked linear time over millennia. For the Red Queen, time wasn't a straight line. It was a series of great wheels within wheels. When she died, her burial date was recorded with absolute precision, linking her biological end to a specific cosmic alignment. To the Maya, if you knew the math of the stars, you knew the mind of the gods. 34. The Wounded Deer. Frida's interior forest. In 1946, Frida Kahlo's physical suffering reached a new crescendo. She had undergone another spinal surgery in New York that failed to provide relief. In response, she painted the little deer. In this piece, she depicts herself as a stag, her own face perched atop the animal's body, which is riddled with 9 arrows. She is lost in a dead forest, the sea visible in the distance, a symbol of a freedom she can see, but never reach. The deer is a Nahuatl symbol from her indigenous roots, but the arrows are a direct reference to the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. It is a fusion of Aztec mythology and Catholic iconography. The painting is a scream on canvas. It tells us that despite her fame, despite her intelligence, she felt like a hunted creature, unable to escape the forest of her own shattered anatomy. 35. The Guilds, the invisible government of 1325. Back in the medieval town, your life is governed by the guild system. If you were a weaver, a blacksmith, or a baker, you didn't just start a business. You were part of a monopoly. The guilds controlled everything. The quality of the bread, the price of a horseshoe, and who was allowed to work. To become a master, you had to spend 7 years as an apprentice, essentially unpaid labor, then several years as a journeyman, traveling from town to hone your craft, only after producing a masterpiece, a literal piece of work that proved your mastery, could you join the guild. They were the medieval equivalent of a labor union, a social club, and a regulatory agency all in one. They looked after your widow if you died and paid for your funeral, but they also ensured that no one undersold the market. In 1325 there was no free market. There was only the guild's shadow. Part 7. The Final Hour. From Darkness to Enlightenment. 36. The Looming Revolution. The Gutenberg Silhouette. While we have spent much of our time in 1325, we must acknowledge the seismic shift that was only a century away. Imagine a world where every book is a miracle. A hand-copied, vellum-bound labour of love that costs as much as a small farm. In 1325, knowledge is a liquid held in a very small, very elite bottle. But the seeds of the Gutenberg revolution were being sown in the shifting trade routes. By the mid-1400s, the printing press would arrive, turning the silent, exclusive word into a roaring public flood. For the first time, a peasant might actually own a piece of paper. This wasn't just a technological change, it was a psychological one. It meant that the priest was no longer the sole gatekeeper of the divine word. It meant that the king's decrees could reach the furthest corner of the realm in days, not months. The Dark Ages didn't end because the lights came on. They ended because the press started running. 37. The Smolny Institute, Catherine's Modern Woman. Catherine the Great understood that to change Russia, she had to change the Russian woman. In 1764, she established the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens in St. Petersburg. This was the first state-run educational institution for women in Europe. Catherine didn't want these girls to be mere ornaments. She wanted them to be new people. They were taught French, Italian, history, geography, and most importantly, the sciences. Catherine visited the school frequently, corresponding with the students as if they were her own daughters. She believed that if the mothers of the next generation were enlightened, the entire empire would eventually follow. It was a radical experiment in a country where, just a century prior, noblewomen were kept in harems, secluded upper chambers, hidden from the eyes of men. Catherine was tearing down the walls of the harem and replacing them with the halls of a laboratory. 38. The Great Collapse. The Ghost Cities of the Maya. We must return to the jungle to address the haunting question. What happened to the Red Queen's people? By the year 900 AD, the great cities of the southern lowlands, including Palanque, were being reclaimed by the vines. This wasn't a single event, but a cascading failure. The Maya had become victims of their own success. As the population swelled, they overfarmed the fragile rainforest soil. Then came the great droughts, century-long periods of low rainfall that turned the sacred reservoirs into cracked mud. The kings, whose power was based on their ability to summon the rain, lost their divine mandate. The people didn't just die. They walked away. They abandoned the massive pyramids and the jade masks, returning to smaller, sustainable farming villages. The jungle moved in with terrifying speed, wrapping its roots around the temples of the Red Queen, keeping her secret for over 1,000 years. 39. Viva la Vida. The final breath of Frida. In the final months of 1954, Frida Kahlo's body was finally surrendering. Her right leg had been amputated due to gangrene, and she was largely confined to the Casa Azul. Yet, in one of her last acts, she painted a vibrant, chaotic celebration of life, a still life of watermelons. Across the crimson flesh of one of the melons, she scrawled the words, "Viva la vida," long live life. It was a defiant final flourish. She attended her last art gallery opening on a hospital bed. carried into the room by 4 men, surrounded by her friends, her tequila and her laughter. When she died at the age of 47, her bed was filled with the flowers from her garden. She had transformed her pain into a visual language that spoke to the entire world. She didn't want to be remembered as a victim of a bus accident, but as a woman who had dared to look at the sun without blinking. 40. Epilogue. The echoes of the ages. We have traveled through 700 years of human history tonight. We have felt the bite of the 1325 frost, the cold ambition of Catherine's palaces, the toxic dust of the Red Queen's tomb, and the electric spirit of Frida's Mexico. History is not a museum. It is a conversation. We are the sum of every struggle we have discussed. Every time you turn on a faucet, you are benefiting from the failures of the medieval cesspit. Every time you read a book, you are honoring the scribes who went blind by candlelight. We are a resilient, stubborn, and deeply strange species. As you drift off tonight, remember that you are part of this long, winding tapestry. The shadows in your room are the same. Shadows that flickered on the walls of the Casa, Azul, and the limestone halls of Pelunk. Sleep well, knowing that you are never truly alone in time. 41. The twilight of the Middle Ages. The birth of the individual. As we leave 1325, we must witness the slow, grinding death of the communal mind. For centuries, you were defined only by your village, your guild, or your lord. But as the 14th century closes, a new ghost enters the room. Humanism. This was the radical idea that you, the individual, had value independent of the church or the crown. We start to see the first portraits where the subject looks back at the viewer. We see the rise of the merchant class. We did. People who gained power through wit and coin rather than blood and soil. The rigid walls of the medieval fortress were beginning to crack, not from cannons, but from the weight of new ideas. This transition was messy, violent, and beautiful. It was the moment humanity decided to stop looking at the dirt of the past and start looking at the horizon of the future. 42. The Romanov Sunset. Catherine's complicated heirs. Catherine the Great died in 1796, leaving behind an empire that was the largest in the world, but also a family dynamic that was toxic. Her son Paul I spent his short reign attempting to undo every single thing his mother had accomplished, simply out of spite for the woman who had usurped his father. The tragedy of Catherine's legacy is that while she was an enlightened ruler, she left the institution of the autocracy, so powerful that it could not be easily reformed by her descendants. Her grandson, Alexander I, would go on to defeat Napoleon, but the seeds of the Russian Revolution were already sown in the very serfdom Catherine failed to abolish. The golden age she created was brilliant, but it was built on a foundation of human bondage that would eventually lead to the basement of the Ipatiev house in 1918. Catherine's ghost lingered in the Winter Palace until the very end, a reminder of what happens when a ruler is more in love with the idea of liberty than the practice of it. 43. The Resurrection of the Red Queen. 1994 and beyond. We return one last time to the humid silence of Temple Thefiade in Palenque, when Arnoldo González Cruz first stepped into that scarlet chamber in 1994. He wasn't just finding a skeleton, he was finding a voice that had been silenced for 1,300 years. Modern science has allowed us to perform a digital autopsy on the Red Queen. We know she suffered from osteoporosis. We know she had a diet rich in maize. We even know her DNA profile. But beyond the biology, her rediscovery sparked a global fascination with the hidden women of history. She reminds us that for every great king like Pakal, there was a woman of equal or greater significance holding the cosmic balance. The Red Queen didn't disappear. She simply waited for a century that was finally ready to understand her power